Hi, and welcome back. We just finished talking about World War I, and now it's time to look at some of the issues that America faced following the war. A couple of things came into play here. One, workers started pushing for new and inventive ways to make their working conditions better. They wanted better conditions and better pay. So what happens? People go on strikes. People don't support these. The public does not support these strikes. It makes sense though, right? Some of you have jobs right now. Maybe some of you work at Tim Hortons, some of you work at McDonald's, or just any other job that you might be able to think of. Take, for example, you work a 10-hour day. Some of you might expect to work 10 hours and get a break, right? Or if you work at Tim Hortons and you work in the bakery and it's 100 degrees, you might not want to work at 100 degrees, though, am I right? Well, these were some of the conditions that these people were working in at the time. And this is some of the things that they wanted to fix. Other things come into play as well. When soldiers were coming back from war, all these jobs that they were going to get were taken by the people who weren't in the war. Other things included the economy was getting adjusted, there was disputes over the League of Nations, the Progressive era changed the whole attitude of the economy. Things were a mess. Things were getting unrestful, and people wanted to just go back to that normal, peaceful lifestyle. So what happens? People who were causing this unrest wanted them out of the country. And these people were unfortunately the foreign-born people and the immigrants. And a new wave came across America. A new attitude came across America. And that attitude was called Nativism. And we'll look at that in just a second. Okay, so we're talking about unrest in the United States and in America. And one of the things we talked about was nativism. So let's define a couple of terms before we get started. Nativism is basically just a prejudice against any foreign-born people. So the people in America were looking to keep American citizens and American jobs for Americans. Let's talk about something else too, something that the United States wanted to do to kind of keep other international powers away, a term called isolationism. The United States wanted to isolate themselves from other world affairs. Kind of makes sense when you're trying to keep immigration and immigrants and foreign-born people out of the country. So what happens? The first thing that comes to mind and the first thing that kind of scares the United States is something called the rise of communism. It starts in Russia, the fall of the Tsar and Vladimir I by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks, which in Russian means the majority, throw this party over and begin to take over this communist rule. Now let's go back and define communism just to make sure we all know we're on the same page here. Communism is basically a dictatorship. And what happens is the party in power takes over all forms of government, all forms of private property, business, and kind of distributes wealth in terms of that way. But you figure, why is it a big deal? This is all in Russia. This is happening all the way in Russia, all the way in Europe, not going to affect us here in the United States. Problem is, a small communist party begins to form in the United States. And eventually, in the early 1920s, almost 70,000 radicals and anarchists are joined in this party. Anarchists, just to make sure we're all on the same page as well, are people, anybody who just is against any form of government. So now we have this big communist party in the United States, and now we start to get some real pressure here on the American people. It's called the Red Scare for a couple of reasons. One, it's starting to scare the American people that all these people are here, and two, the communists call themselves the Reds because of their red flag. So now we get to see all these little things start to unravel. We see many things, including some acts start to be taken in place. We see some jury and trials start to take place, and we see some results starting to happen from this takeover in the Communist Party. We'll talk all of that in just a second. I think I forgot. Okay, so we're talking about the Red Scare again. And just to catch us up again, just a reminder, the Red Scare was this communist movement that started in Russia, and now it's starting to come into the United States, and people are starting to get nervous about this. Now again, while the Red Scare was short-lived, it started to feed suspicion in the mind of these American people. Now again, they were losing their jobs to these immigrants. They were losing their, their standard of living was going up, as we stated earlier. They weren't getting the jobs they wanted. People were stealing them from them. They wanted something done. Okay? Now this nativist attitude started to really resonate with these people, and basically what it did was, it made them more prejudiced, made them more racial. And one of the most famous court cases during this time period was one that included two Italian immigrants, Sacco and Vanzetti. Now they were both from Italy, came over here looking for jobs, looking for a new opportunity. In May of 1920, they were both convicted of robbery and murder of both a paymaster and his guard in a small fishing town in Massachusetts. Now both of them claimed they had alibis, both of them pled not guilty, they had many people within the town backing them up. They had evidence that they were at their job, they were doing their job, but because of this new nativist attitude, they were both found guilty. Now, there was big uprising, not only within the United States, but worldwide. Latin America, Europe, even Asia caught wind of this court trial, and they wanted to do something about it. And now, all this unrest starts to come out in public eyes, and now they want to do something about it. But even though with all this new testimony, all this new evidence, the jury still finds him guilty, and ultimately the judge sentences them both to death. But before Vanzetti dies, he gives one last statement that was recorded in the National Experience, and I want to read that for you right now. Again, this was quoted by Vanzetti right before he was put to death on August 23rd, 1927. In all my life, I have never stole, never killed, never spilled any blood. We were tried during a time when there was a hysteria of resentment and hate against the people of our principles, against the foreign. I am suffering because I am a radical, and indeed, I am a radical. I have suffered because I was an Italian, and indeed, I am an Italian. If you could execute me 2 times, and if I could be reborn 2 other times, I would live again to do what I have done already. So you can tell he has no regret for what he did. He pleads not guilty. He sticks by his case, but this new nativist attitude is taking control, and it's starting to spin out of control, and things like this start to happen. People are executed, and it's not just this one famous case. It's happening over and over and over again. And now people are wanting to start to limit immigration, and we'll see some of those things that are taken into action in just a second. Okay, so we've talked about the Red Scare, we've talked about the Sacco and Vanzetti case. Now let's talk about ways in which they try to limit immigration. One of the new waves or new attitudes that came across was this saying called, "Keep America for Americans." And this saying that was adopted back in the early 1920s kind of reminds me of a personal story that I had to go through with my family. My father was a technician at Motorola. It's an American company, it's an electronics company. It then got bought out by a German company called Continental. After a few years he had been working there, he had noticed some changes that were going on, kind of behind the scenes. He wasn't sure what was going on. Out of nowhere, they announced that they started to move their company slowly but surely down to certain cities in Mexico. Now picture this. My father is doing his job. He was then asked to take his position down to Mexico, and then he had to train these Mexican workers how to do his job. So this saying that gets started to develop in the early 1920s got me thinking about a personal experience back in my own family. So now let's jump back in the 1920s where we started off. There's always been these new waves of immigrants coming across, even in the early 1800s. We've seen it all across from everywhere, Eastern, Western Europe, even in Asia, and many places else as well. So why was this new thing coming about right now? Well, let's not forget, the war had just ended, and people were looking for jobs. These soldiers were looking for jobs, and they were not finding them. These foreign-born or these immigrants were taking them for them. So what do? They established the Emergency Quota Systems Act of 1921. Between 1919 and 1921, the United States saw an increase of immigration of up to 600%. That's right, 600%. So now you're wondering where all these jobs went? There they go. They go to these immigrants. What did this system do? Well, first, eventually it ended up, it stopped in 1 year total, 150,000 immigrants total for 1 year. But that only limited it to the immigrants in the East. So people from Canada and Latin America were still allowed in. Also, it prohibited Japanese immigrants from coming into the country. And that's something you might want to consider as well as we move further down the line, further in the year. These tensions that started to resonate between the Japanese and the Americans. So now we see these laws being put into place, we see these acts being put into place, and now we're seeing these tensions that start to rise between people from Europe, Latin America, and Japan, and now we're starting to see all this come into place, and we'll see where it takes us from there. So let's kind of wrap up what we've been talking about this whole time here. You know, I want to make sure that it's very clear, this whole Red Scare, this whole limiting immigration, the whole tensions with the Japanese, this is all going to come into play later on down the road, and especially further down into the school year. So let's keep this in mind. You know, this is where it all starts. So as we finish here, let's think about what has happened in the past and how it connects to the future. And now we talk about labor unrest, we talk about these acts being put into place. There's many other acts that limit immigration that we'll get into in a couple of weeks. But I want you to start to get the feel of what's going on in the United States at this time and how then it will start to resonate and kind of dictate what happens in the